The 8th, 1996. I'm Sheila Carman Educational Associates, and I'm going to talk about my brother, Donald Russell Carman, who died, I think it was January the 24th, 1996. Interesting life. A lot of very good things and a lot of not very good things. And when he died, he was saying, I've had a really good life. He and I were a really good life. He and I were, and my other brother John, were the children of Russell Aubrey Carman, a lawyer, and his wife, Muriel Dundas Piggott Carman. It was not a good marriage, and I think primarily because my father was a schizophrenic and became quite violent towards the end of their marriage. When my mother, I think, was about 40, and he was 10 years older, he would be about 50. He eventually went to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and was in the mental hospital there for a long time until he died. But during the period when he was quite disturbed, he ceased, I think, to be a money maker, and we went and lived on a farm, his farm, near Regina. We were all born in Regina, and the farm was I think 5,000 acres, and there was a hired hand, and I presume there must have been other workers, because I think he grew wheat. And he also used it for horses. He played polo, and he was the captain of the polo team, and he trained the horses at the farm. He had a called Kavanaugh, who used to help him at the farm. Anyway, when I was 3, and Don was 9, Don was 6, he was 3 years older than I am, we went down and lived at the farm, Mother having never been on a farm in her life, except for holidays when I used to go to the farm. But we lived there for 3 years, and during that period, Don had his own horse, I believe, called Lady, and he went to school on the prairies by horse. He was the only one in the family who did, because John was 4 and a half when I was 3. And Don had a very, very, very close feeling for the prairies, much more than I did or John. So much so that later in life, when he started to write a lot of poetry, he called himself the Bard of Balgony. Balgony being the Four Corners town village near the farm. Many years later, in fact, it was something like 5 years ago, when the Regina Rough Riders football team were playing in the finals, Regina won, and Don was so excited and so thrilled and gratified. He'd have thought he'd been living in Regina all those years, which of course he hadn't. 9, we went to live in Belleville. It was my father's home, and his father had considerable funds, and I think he probably bought a partnership for my father with a law firm. But my father really was past working at that stage, and not very long after, Mother took him to the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, where he was diagnosed as schizophrenic. And after that, he just sort of went from place to place and never really settled down until he got back to Regina. And when he got back there, his friends looked after him for, I think, 2 or 3 years. spent his time, I gather, in the public library writing the story of his life. The story of his life was to replace the Bible. He was admitted to the Weyburn mental hospital in Saskatchewan, which was at Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And he lived there until he died. It must have been something like 25 or 35 years. And he died there. I'm back in Belleville. Things were pretty tight financially. We didn't have any money. And Dad had left quite a load of debt behind him. But we continued. I didn't know very much about this. I was 6 when we got to Belleville. But when Don was 14, because we were so strapped financially, he went to work. I've forgotten where he worked first. I think it may have been a brokerage office. He was very tall, very skinny, and I guess looked older than his years. But he worked there till he was, I think, 18, and then got into the Bank of Montreal, where he stayed for many, many years. At the same time, Mother got a job working as secretary for Dr. Faulkner, who was a friend of Mother's and Dad's, and she worked as his secretary for many years. In the Bank of Montreal, we all went and moved to Toronto when Dr. Faulkner became Minister of Health, and Don was in the Bank of Montreal in Toronto. Wellesley and Young, I think, for quite a long time, did well, and I think was reasonably happy at it. And then met Kay Murray, who was a fashion artist at Eaton's. No, at Simpson's. She was a wonderful woman, very attractive and very, very bright. And she and Don lived a very good life together. They had the first time I ever saw a black person in a white home was at their house. They had friends of all types, and went to concerts, went to plays. They were great people. They were very good to me. After I finished training in Montreal, I went to the Toronto University and took public health nursing, and they were good to me then. So good that they took me to see Othello with Paul Robeson, which was one of the great thrills of my life. They were a wonderful couple. When Don was about, they had 2 children. They had trouble having children, but then they had adopted a boy, Christopher, and 11 months after they adopted him, they had a child of their own, a girl, Suzanne, and they were really nicely established, I think. At that time, Don had left the Bank of Montreal and had gone to St. Andrew's Boys' School as the bursar. Then, when I was pregnant with Peter, who was born in 1945, we had been out, Tommy and I had been out for dinner and came home, and Mother was outside. I didn't know why she was outside, but she said that Don had been fired under a cloud from St. Andrews. The cloud being that somebody had broken into his safe, except that he didn't lock his safe, apparently. He didn't feel it was ever necessary. But somebody had taken some traveler's checks and had also taken Kay's engagement ring. This was a mystery that was never solved. Don had some ideas about why it happened, because he knew something about the headmaster, which was not very desirable to know. He knew it because he was on the board of the college. Anyway, Don and Kay and Christopher and Suzanne came to us at 15 Heath Street, Toronto, and they settled in on the top floor. We had 2 floors. We had 2 floors. His mother had lived on that 3rd floor, for her room and a bathroom there. But Kay and Don and the children were there for a period until Don got a house. They found a house out in Pine Grove near Woodbridge on the river. It was just a summer cottage in very, very bad condition, but it was a place of their own. Don got a job, his first job, as operating machinery in a gravel pit. Hardly the sort of job that he was trained for, but it was a job, it was money, and they settled into Pine Grove and coped well, very well. They were both wonderful. Then Don got another job at a factory, Moffat's factory. That was barking. We're at Ketchikoma. We have here Ginza, 8-year-old standard poodle, Skookie, 12-year-old miniature poodle, and Ginza barks quite a lot, so I think that was probably her. Back to Dawn. I think I may be repeating myself, but when I last talked about him, I think I had him with Carman Educational Associates and on his road to success. On the whole, they managed very well. Kay was such a super person. Unfortunately, she died when she was a little over 60. About 1976. She had a ruptured bowel, which was tragic. Don went along after that on his own. By this time, Suzanne was married to Don Culp, a Niagara fruit farmer, and Christopher, Kay and Don's adopted son, had a varied career, graduated from Queen's University as an engineer, civil engineer, and then wandered considerably. Amongst other jobs, he was a croupier in Holland, in England, I think in Africa. As a matter of fact, he must have been in Spain too, because he was jailed in Spain for 5 years. And Don spent an enormous amount of effort and money to get him released. Then he came back to Canada and was I'm having trouble with this machine. It's probably my fault. In any case, I'll continue with what I can say. Christopher, after he was released from the Spanish jail, came back to Canada, worked that summer for Don Culp in the fruit farm, and then drove taxi in Toronto for quite a long time. Now he's back in Pine Grove. Actually, after Kay died, Don was on his own for a bit. Then he met Jean, can't remember her other name. She was an artist, and I think a worthy companion to Don. I think they enjoyed each other, and then they got married. Jean had one daughter, Sassy, product of her first marriage to a bush pilot. I think the true love of her life. And she and Sassy were very close, very good friends. And at first Sassy didn't think much of Donald. She didn't think he was worthy of her mother or something. And so she But she came around, and they eventually became very good friends. And she was very, very good to them. Because as time went on, Jean got emphysema and was on oxygen. And that was, very, very difficult. Dawn did the cooking. Dawn looked after her very well. Sassy would come periodically and stay for a bit and take care of the situation. Now, in August 1966, and I would think it would have been something like February of this year, that Don was told that he had cancer of the pancreas. He called me the same day, the day he heard, to tell me he and I had been corresponding at a great rate, getting very good correspondence going. So I was grateful that he let me know then. But it progressed quite fast, actually. Jean got pneumonia, went into hospital, which I would think must have been about December 1995, and she was in hospital, and Don was home and looking after himself. Jean was in hospital with pneumonia, which was really to be expected with emphysema. Don looked after himself, and then he got to the stage. He had said, "I won't ever leave this house. I will die in this house." But at sometime, I think in January probably, he became unable to cope actually. So he asked Suzanne to take him to hospital, which she did. And he was going downhill very quickly actually there. I didn't see him at that stage. But after about, after I think about 2 weeks, Suzanne thought, this is no good. He must go he must come home. So she went through all the routine that was necessary to get him home, with bed and a commode. And she put the bed in the living room of the house, looking out over the stream, great big doors in the living room. And then Lee went down to look after, to help Suzanne. I think I may have said this before. In any case, I went down Lee went on the Friday, I think, and I went down on the Sunday. Tommy took me down, and it was decided that he would not stay. He felt that there really was very little he could do, but everybody felt that I should stay, and I wanted to stay. So I stayed on from Sunday, and then on Tuesday, I think it was, Gord Martin came down from Montreal to see Don and stayed overnight. Actually, he had spent a day with Don when Don was in hospital. They were just a wonderful man, just charming, and so fond of Don. They were a very, very close relationship. Anyway, he stayed over Tuesday night, and Wednesday Don was, he'd been getting more and more, sleeping more and more. He was, I think, Lee and Suzanne sat him up once and cleaned him, because of course he was incontinent. But anyway, in the morning, we were all there, and he just stopped breathing, just died. There was nothing startling or upsetting about it. It was just, he'd come to the end. We were all very happy for him. came and got me, and I went home on that Wednesday and stayed until, I think the funeral, as I remember, was on Saturday. And it was a horrifying day. It rained all day and it was cold and miserable. But we went to the Woodbridge Cemetery where Kay was buried, and he was buried right near Kay. Jean was in hospital at this stage and not well enough to possibly come to the funeral. Sassy's husband came, but not Sassy, because she said she couldn't bear to go to funerals. But after the funeral, there was a wake at the house. Very many people, including Betty Stevenson, who was in Belmont House in Toronto, and not really with it at all. But Romain, her son, brought her. She was in a wheelchair, and I talked to her, and she seemed. We didn't talk about anything serious, obviously, but she seemed reasonably comfortable, reasonably happy, which was a relief for me, because I was very, very fond of Betty. She was Kay's sister and such a wonderful woman. After the funeral, there was unfortunately some miserable things happened about the will. Dawn had left the house 1/4 to Suzanne, 1/4 to Christopher, 1/4 to Jean, and 1/4 to Sassy, which was mighty fine for them, I might say, particularly since Jean was close to dying. She did die, actually, within about, I think a month of Dawn's death. But it didn't go to court, it went to lawyers, and they eventually settled it. Sassy came and picked up Jean's things in a really nasty way, but eventually the settlement was she got her money, and Christopher, with Suzanne's help, got the house. So he and his dear girl Isabel are living there. It's wonderful for Suzanne and for Christopher that one of the family is in the house. I wanted very much to do this, I'd really rather like to have written a biography of Dawn, but I think it was unlikely that I would. But I thought if I got some of my memories of Dawn onto tape, it would be of help to everybody. He meant a lot to a lot of people. He used to be surprised. He said to me one time, people like me, as though he was surprised that people did. But he was, a very, very bright person, very intelligent, and very modern. He was the one who told me that Elvis Presley was such a very important figure in the musical world. He started a period of music, which, rock and roll, I guess it is. But I would never have thought of Elvis Presley as being an important person. But Don said he was. He also was a Rolling Stone subscriber. The Rolling Stone magazine being a very upbeat magazine from California. Very, very modern. I haven't told you is what his dreadful bad luck physically. I don't remember anything very bad about his childhood except that he had scarlet fever. Nobody else in the family got scarlet fever, but Dawn did. And then when he was about 16 or 17, he was having a lot of pain when he urinated. And I don't know the what the doctor said about it. But in any case, this was when we lived in Belleville. He went to the bathroom one day and came roaring out of the bathroom with his hand out and saying, "Here it is, here it is." He had a stone in his kidney that he passed. So that was cured. Then, when he was about 19, he was having a lot of back pain, severe back pain. And Mother took him to the best doctors in Toronto, and nobody diagnosed him. Then somebody said to her, "Why don't you take him to Montreal, to the neurological, where Dr. Penfield is, and see if they can find out what's wrong?" So Mother took him down to the Royal Victoria, not to the Neurological Institute, because it was turned out that he had I guess it was neurological. He had a spina bifida, which is an outcropping of the spinal cord. But usually it comes out outside, so it's visible from the back. But his went inside, so it was not visible. That's why they had such trouble diagnosing it. But they did diagnose it, and Dr. Cohn, who was a neurosurgeon rather, who worked with Dr. Penfield, he operated on him, and he was in the cast for, I think it was 9 months, from shoulder to feet. He was very tall. He was about 6'4.5", and they had to have a special bed made for him. I don't think they had a special bed made. No, I think what they did was put a piece of board at the end of the bed, so that he could stretch out. And he had to stretch out, obviously, if he was in a cast. But that was a very severe disease. But then later on, he had a hernia, not just one hernia one side, but 2 hernias on one side and 3 hernias on the other. And then he became very ill about 4 years ago, I guess. Oh, he had a very bad hip. And Jean had 2 artificial hips put in, very successfully. So it was decided that Dawn would have an artificial hip put in. I think that there was medical fault here, because they operated on him and put the new hip in, and he went into DTs. He was drinking too much. He was also smoking. So he was appallingly ill. He was in intensive care for, must have been something like 2 weeks. We also had tuberculosis, and not just a year in sanitarium, but also lobectomy. One lobe of his lung was removed. Actually, that was the only time I ever nursed as a practical nurse. At least nursed. I was a graduate nurse. I graduated from the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. The only time I ever practiced a private patient was Dawn, and he was in the sand. And I donned my uniform and went down and looked after him. And I was enormously pleased that I did, because he had a nurse who didn't want him to become addicted to morphine, so she restricted his, I don't know whether it was morphine or Demerol, she restricted his painkillers, and he was suffering intensely. So I protested rather strongly, said if she didn't call the doctor and get something more for him, I would. So she did. And anyway, he recovered from that. But then the later one, this last, let me think, this about 3 or 4 years ago, I said, when he was in the Western Hospital, the Wellesley Hospital, and back to the Western, I think. Anyway, it was a long, long session, and he recovered, got home, very weak, During that period when he was in the hospital, I went down and stayed with Jean and looked after her for 4 days because Sassy was away. Then when Sassy came home, I at least came back to Montreal where she lives. She came and looked after Jean, and I went home. We went to see Don frequently. And it was desperate. It didn't seem possible that he could survive. However, he did survive. He had a great spirit, undoubtedly. He survived, and he was getting better, getting his strength back, becoming more himself when the cancer was diagnosed. I'm quite sure I haven't begun to tell you all the physical problems he had in his life, but that's really enough of that tale of woe. I think that he was a man of integrity, intelligence, and because of his year in San, a poet. He had read poetry intensively while he was in San. It made his period there a joy and not a penance. And he then started to write poetry. I didn't know anything about this actually until the last 4 or 5 years since we've been corresponding. But he went west. He was working for Eagle Island then. And he went west. And on the train, going across the prairie somehow or other, inspiration just took over, and he wrote and wrote and wrote poetry. And after that, he brought his poetry to me to read one time, and I was enormously flattered to be asked to read it. But he said he would get up in the morning and it would just roll off of poetry, a lot of it nonsense poetry, but some of it really good poetry. And at his funeral, there was no minister, there was no religious ceremony because Don had no orthodox beliefs. But I read a piece of his poetry, and Peter spoke about him. Tommy read a little bit of the burial service. Suzanne Christopher spoke about him. This is standing out in the rain in a cold, cold January day. It was the last favor we could do to Don, for Don. I have 2 or 3 more thoughts that I would like to tell you about Don's life. One important one, after Kay died, Lee, our daughter and Don's niece, went and looked after him. He was so devastated by Kay's death that he had ceased to care about life. She stayed with him and fed him very well for about 4 months, and after that he managed on his own. I also would like to read you something from our cousin Bob Apt Roberts. Bob and Don were about the same age. Actually, I wrote to Bob after Don died, and this is the letter he sent to me. I have very few memories of Donald, whom, of course, I had seldom seen. They lived in Winnipeg. My most vivid memory is of him at the farm. He rode with such dash and had a very pretty pony. Was her name Lady? Anyhow, I remember him galloping off from the station at Balgony in a very dashing fashion. I got a horse to gallop, was coming back from the station on an old white plough horse. And then he shied at a badger hole, and I fell off. Had to walk a long way to the farm. I can't remember seeing Donald during the war when I was in Toronto a time or two, though I do remember seeing his wife. But then I can remember that he and his wife lived in the Don River Valley, so I must have seen him. If memory serves me, and it frequently doesn't these days, Don was born in April, a month before I was, and would have been 82 this year. I guess that's better than average. End of the letter from Bob, which was so great to get.